Black Death. In just 4 years, it killed more people than both world wars combined. It brought empires to their knees, toppled governments, and literally changed the course of human history forever. This is the story of humanity's greatest enemy, the Black Death. Welcome back to Sleek Minds Saga. I'm your host, and today we're talking about one of the most terrifying chapters in human history. Picture this. It's 1347, and you're living in medieval Europe. Life is hard, but predictable. Then, seemingly overnight, your entire world crumbles. A mysterious disease begins spreading like wildfire. Within days, your neighbors are dead. Within weeks, entire villages are ghost towns. Within months, 1/3 of everyone you've ever known is gone forever. This isn't fiction. This actually happened, and it wasn't the first time. The first strike, Justinian's plague. Our story begins over 800 years before the Black Death, in the year 541 CE. The Byzantine Empire, ruled by Emperor Justinian, was at its peak. Constantinople was the jewel of the Mediterranean world, a city of 500,000 people, the largest in Europe. Justinian had a dream: to restore the glory of the Roman Empire. His armies had reconquered much of the Mediterranean. Everything seemed possible. But then, something arrived that would shatter those dreams forever. It came by ship, hidden in grain shipments from Egypt, carried by fleas on black rats. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, though they didn't know its name yet, they just knew it killed. The symptoms were horrific: fever that burned like fire, painful swellings called buboes that could grow as large as apples, vomiting blood, delirium, and death. Quick, agonizing death. The Byzantine historian Procopius witnessed it firsthand. He wrote, "At first the deaths were more than normal, then the mortality rose still higher, and afterwards the tale of dead reached 5,000 each day, and again it even came to 10,000 and still more than that." In Constantinople alone, up to 300,000 people died. The empire's dreams of restoration died with them. Justinian's plague, as it came to be known, killed an estimated 25 million people across the Mediterranean world. But this was just the beginning. The worst was yet to come. The Mongol connection. Fast forward to the 13th century. The Mongols have created the largest contiguous land empire in human history. From Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, their empire spans continents. And with it comes something revolutionary: the Silk Road. For the first time in centuries, goods, ideas, and people could travel safely from Asia to Europe. Spices, silk, and silver flowed along these ancient highways. But something else was traveling too, something deadly. In the remote steppes of Central Asia, Yersinia pestis lived quietly in populations of marmots and other rodents. It had been there for thousands of years, contained in its natural reservoir. But human expansion was about to change everything. The year is 1346. The Mongol Golden Horde is besieging the Genoese trading city of Caffa in modern-day Ukraine. But something is wrong in the Mongol camp. Soldiers are dying not from battle wounds, but from disease. What happened next would become one of history's first recorded acts of biological warfare. The Mongol commander made a terrible decision. If his army was dying, he would make sure his enemies shared the same fate. They loaded their catapults with the corpses of plague victims and hurled them into the city. The Italian chronicler Gabriele de Mussi wrote, "The rotting bodies tainted the air and poisoned the water supply. Soon the defenders were dying faster than the besiegers." The surviving Genoese traders fled by ship, racing back to their Mediterranean trading posts. They thought they had escaped. They had no idea they were carrying death with them. Arrival in Europe, October 1347. The port of Messina, Sicily. 12 Genoese galleys limp into harbor. The few sailors still alive are covered in black boils and coughing up blood. Most of their crewmates are already dead. The Sicilian authorities immediately ordered the ships to leave, but it was too late. The Black Death had arrived in Europe, and it was hungry. What followed was the most devastating pandemic in recorded human history. The plague spread with terrifying speed. From Sicily to mainland Italy, from Italy to France, from France to England. By 1348, it had reached Paris. By 1349, London. By 1350, it had penetrated the farthest corners of Europe. In Florence, the Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio witnessed the horror firsthand. He wrote, "How many valiant men, how many fair ladies, breakfast with their kinfolk, and that same night supped with their ancestors in the next world." Medieval medicine was powerless against the plague. Doctors tried everything: bloodletting, burning herbs, even treating patients with crushed unicorn horn. Nothing worked. The disease killed rich and poor alike. In London, bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. New cemeteries were built overnight. In Paris, the dead were stacked like cordwood. The chronicler Jean de Venette wrote, "The mortality was so great that for a long time more than 500 bodies were carried daily with great devotion to the cemetery." The numbers are staggering. England lost 40% of its population. France lost half. Some regions of Germany lost 60%. In total, between 75 and 200 million people died, up to 60% of Europe's entire population. Entire villages were wiped off the map. Thousands of communities simply ceased to exist. The England of 1351 was a fundamentally different place than the England of 1347. Social collapse. But the Black Death wasn't just a medical disaster. It was a complete social collapse. When a third of the population dies within 4 years, civilization itself begins to crumble. Agriculture collapsed. With so many farmers dead, fields lay fallow. Crops rotted in the ground. Livestock wandered free, with no one left to tend them. Food prices skyrocketed for the survivors. The rigid social order of medieval Europe began to break down. With so many nobles dead, the surviving peasants suddenly had bargaining power. They demanded higher wages, better working conditions, even freedom from serfdom. In England, this led to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. In France, peasant uprisings called Jacqueries erupted across the countryside. The old feudal system was dying along with its people. Religious extremism flourished. Groups of flagellants roamed the countryside, whipping themselves bloody, believing they could atone for humanity's sins. The danse macabre, the dance of death, became a popular artistic theme. Terrified and desperate for someone to blame, many turned to scapegoating. Jewish communities across Europe were accused of poisoning wells. Thousands were murdered in pogroms from France to Germany. Entire Jewish communities were wiped out. Trade networks that had taken centuries to build collapsed overnight. Cities that had been centers of learning and commerce became ghost towns. The University of Oxford nearly closed. Venice, once the richest city in Europe, lost 3/5 of its population. To put this in perspective, if a disaster of similar proportions hit today, the United States would lose 100 million people. Europe would lose 200 million. It would be the end of civilization as we know it. The long aftermath. Europe would never be the same. The survivors found themselves in a world with abundant land, abandoned houses, and empty jobs. For the first time in centuries, ordinary people had choices. Ironically, this devastation may have helped trigger the Renaissance. With so much death, the value of individual human life increased. Art became more personal, more emotional. The concept of humanism was born from humanity's darkest hour. Real wages increased dramatically. The surviving peasants could demand better pay and working conditions. This led to improved diets, better housing, and ultimately a higher standard of living for ordinary people. The feudal system, already weakening, finally collapsed. Centralized nation-states emerged to fill the power vacuum. The foundations of modern Europe were laid in the ruins of the medieval world. The plague also forced Europeans to confront the limitations of medieval medicine. This sparked interest in more systematic approaches to health and disease. The foundations of modern medicine were laid by people trying to understand what had killed so many. But the plague wasn't finished with Europe. It returned again and again. In 1361, 1369, 1374, 1390. Each outbreak killed thousands more. The Great Plague of London in 1665 killed 100,000 people. It wasn't until the 1700s that plague finally retreated from Europe. Today, we know exactly what caused the Black Death. Yersinia pestis, a bacterium spread by fleas on rats. It's still with us. There are about 1,000 cases of plague each year worldwide. But now we have antibiotics. What once killed millions can now be cured with a simple course of medication. The lessons of the Black Death echo through our modern world. During COVID-19, we saw similar patterns: trade disruption, social unrest, scapegoating of minorities. The human response to pandemic disease hasn't changed much in 700 years. Climate change is now melting the permafrost of Siberia, potentially releasing ancient bacteria and viruses that have been frozen for thousands of years. Some scientists worry we could face new pandemics from ancient pathogens. By studying DNA from Black Death victims, scientists have traced the evolution of Yersinia pestis. They've discovered that the medieval plague was even more deadly than we thought, genetically optimized for rapid spread and high mortality. The Black Death remains humanity's greatest demographic disaster. It killed more people in 4 years than any war, any famine, any natural disaster in recorded history. It ended the Middle Ages and ushered in the modern world. But perhaps its greatest lesson is this: human civilization is more fragile than we think. A microscopic bacterium brought the mighty empires of medieval Europe to their knees. It changed everything: economics, politics, religion, art, even the way we think about life and death. The next time you take modern medicine for granted, remember the Black Death. Remember that the difference between civilization and chaos can be as small as a flea bite. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's darkest chapters, please like and subscribe for more Dark History Chronicles. Next week, we'll explore the fall of Constantinople and the end of the Byzantine Empire. Until then, stay curious and remember, history is never really over.